The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet stretch of road just outside the city limits. It was one of those days that felt ordinary in every way. Birds chirping, a light breeze rustling through the trees. The kind of calm that makes you forget the world can still surprise you. Behind the wheel of a modest silver sedan, a woman drove with her windows down, letting the air brush against her skin. She wasn't in a hurry. In fact, she welcomed the slow drive. It gave her a rare moment to think without the weight of her job pressing down on her shoulders. She worked for the federal government, though you wouldn't know it by looking at her. No uniform, no flashy car, no radio crackling with urgent calls. Just a woman in a simple blouse, sunglasses perched on her nose, humming softly to a song playing from an old playlist. What most people didn't realize, and what she preferred to keep hidden, was that she held one of the most powerful positions in the Drug Enforcement Administration's regional office. She led a quiet but critical team tasked with rooting out corruption within law enforcement itself. It was dangerous work, often thankless, and always done in the shadows. She'd spent the last 6 weeks tracking a troubling pattern. Drugs seized during routine traffic stops were disappearing from evidence lockers. Not just small amounts, kilos at a time. And every trail, no matter how faint, seemed to point back to the same local precinct. She hadn't come forward with her suspicions yet. Not until she had proof. Not until she could look someone in the eye and say, "I saw what you did." So she'd taken to driving through the area herself, observing, listening, blending in. Today was supposed to be another quiet data point in a long investigation. Then the lights flashed, red and blue, sudden and sharp, cutting through the peaceful afternoon like a blade. She checked her mirror. A patrol car had pulled up behind her, its siren off but its presence unmistakable. She signaled and eased onto the shoulder, her hands resting lightly on the wheel. Her pulse didn't race. She'd been stopped before, sometimes as part of her cover, sometimes by coincidence. She knew the drill. Stay calm, be polite, don't give them a reason. The officer who approached was tall, with a stiff posture and a hand resting near his belt. He didn't smile, didn't greet her, just stood there for a long moment, staring through the window like he was trying to decide if she belonged on this road at all. "License and registration," he said, voice flat. She handed them over without a word, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. He glanced at the documents, then back at her face, eyes narrowing slightly. "You know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir," she replied, voice steady. "Was I speeding?" "You were going 10 under the limit," he said, as if that were a crime. "Driving like you're hiding something." She didn't react. She'd heard lines like that before, coded language wrapped in authority. She simply nodded as if considering his words and waited. A second officer appeared at her passenger window. Younger but with the same guarded expression. He leaned in slightly, scanning the inside of her car like he expected to find a bomb under the seat. His eyes landed on her purse, then the glove compartment, then the back seat. "You got anything in the car we should know about?" The second officer asked. "No," she said. "Just my things. Mind if we take a look?" It wasn't really a question. She knew that. Refusing would only make things worse, give them an excuse to escalate. So she gave a small nod. "Go ahead." The first officer walked back to his cruiser, likely running her plates. The second stayed by the car, watching her like a hawk. She kept her breathing even, her posture relaxed. Inside, her mind was already working, recording details, noting behavior, filing away every word and gesture. Her phone, tucked just out of sight in the center console, was recording audio. A small camera hidden near the rearview mirror captured everything in crisp detail. None of this was accidental. She'd prepared for moments like this, though she'd hoped not to live through one so soon. Minutes passed. The first officer returned, his expression unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle, please." She did as asked, keeping her hands visible. The air felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. The younger officer opened her door and began a slow, methodical search of the interior. He checked under the seats, lifted the floor mats, ran his hands along the seams of the upholstery. She watched him, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. What were they looking for? Or rather, what were they planning to find? Then she saw it. While the first officer stood nearby, pretending to review her license, the younger one reached into his own pocket. His movements were quick, practiced. He leaned into the car, fumbled near the glove compartment as if searching, and in one smooth motion slipped something inside. She didn't flinch. Didn't gasp. Didn't even blink too hard. but her stomach tightened. This was it. The moment she'd been waiting for, and dreading. Seconds later, the younger officer pulled back with a look of mock surprise. "Hey," he called to his partner, holding up a small plastic bag. "Found this?" Her heart didn't pound. Her hands didn't shake. Years of training, of walking into rooms where everyone wanted her to fail, had taught her how to hold herself together when everything around her was falling apart. She simply looked at the bag, then at the officers, and said, "That's not mine." The older officer smirked. "Sure it isn't." They cuffed her gently, not roughly but firmly enough to make the point. As they led her to the back of the patrol car, she asked for her rights, for a lawyer, for a supervisor. The officers exchanged glances, amused. They thought they'd won, thought they'd silenced another problem before it could grow. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the woman they were arresting wasn't just any driver. She was the one person in the entire system with the authority, the evidence, and the patience to bring their whole operation crashing down. And as the patrol car pulled onto the road, siren still off, she sat quietly in the back seat, already planning her next move. Because justice, she'd learned long ago, doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it arrives in silence, calm, certain, and ready to expose the truth no matter who tries to bury it. The back seat of the patrol car smelled like stale coffee and old vinyl. It wasn't the first time she'd been in one, but it was the first time she'd been in one as a suspect. She kept her hands folded in her lap, wrists still cuffed, and watched the world blur past the window. Trees, gas stations, streetlights, each one a silent witness to what was unfolding. She didn't speak, didn't protest. She knew better than to waste energy on outrage when strategy would serve her better. The two officers up front were relaxed now, almost chatty. The tension of the stop had melted into smug satisfaction. They thought they'd done something clever, something clean. They didn't realize they'd just handed her the final piece of evidence she needed. At the precinct, they led her through a side entrance. Less public, less chance of questions. The hallway was dimly lit, the linoleum floor scuffed from years of boots and bad decisions. An officer at the front desk barely glanced up as they passed. Routine, just another arrest. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding room with a metal bench and a flickering overhead light. Still, she said nothing beyond what was required. Name, date of birth. "I'd like to speak with an attorney." One of the arresting officers lingered in the doorway for a moment, arms crossed. "You really thought you could cruise through here with that in your car and no one would notice?" he said, voice low, almost conversational. She met his eyes. "I didn't put it there," he chuckled, shaking his head like she was a child who didn't understand the rules of the game. "Doesn't matter what you say now. We got it on record. Case is closed." He walked off, confident, unbothered. And that was the moment she knew. This wasn't just about one bad stop. This was part of something bigger. They'd done this before. Probably many times. And each time, someone without her resources, her training, or her network had taken the fall. She sat alone for nearly an hour. Long enough for the adrenaline to fade and the real work to begin. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't a jailer or a lawyer. It was a woman in a crisp navy suit, hair pulled back, expression unreadable. She carried a tablet under one arm and a sealed envelope in the other. "Mind if I join you?" the woman asked, though she was already stepping inside. The woman in cuffs gave a small nod. "You're late." "Traffic," the newcomer said with a faint smile. She placed the envelope on the bench between them, then tapped a code into her tablet. A soft chime sounded from the other side of the room, the door locking automatically. Privacy protocol, standard for high-level internal operations. She uncuffed her colleague with a small key, then sat down. "We've got everything," she said quietly. "Audio, video, the whole thing. Plus, the moment they planted that bag, our system flagged the officer's body cam feed as interrupted for exactly 9 seconds. Convenient." The woman rubbed her wrists, flexing her fingers. "They didn't even try to be subtle." "No," her colleague agreed. "Because they didn't think they had to be." For weeks, their team had been watching this precinct. Not just these two officers, but the whole chain. Dispatchers who rerouted calls, supervisors who signed off on missing evidence logs, even a local tow yard that held impounded cars just a little too long. It was a machine, well-oiled and efficient, and it ran on stolen drugs and silenced voices. Now, They had proof that the machine had turned on someone it couldn't control. Back in the main station, the two officers were filing their report, laughing about how easy the arrest had been. They'd already logged the drugs into evidence, fake evidence of course, and were preparing to close the case before the end of shift. One even joked about grabbing dinner after. Life would go on as usual, but then the front doors opened, not with a bang, not with shouting, but with quiet authority. 3 federal agents in dark jackets stepped inside, badges held high. Behind them came a senior internal affairs investigator and a regional DEA compliance officer. The room fell silent. Even the phone seemed to stop ringing. The older of the 2 officers looked up from his desk, confused. "Can I help you?" The lead agent didn't smile. "We're here for Officers Reynolds and Diaz. You're both suspended, effective immediately. Your credentials are revoked. Please surrender your weapons and badges." The color drained from their faces. "What's this about?" The younger one stammered. "Tampering with evidence. Fabrication of criminal charges. Conspiracy to distribute controlled substances." The agent paused. "And attempted obstruction of a federal investigation." That last part hit like a hammer. They exchanged a glance, sudden panic replacing their earlier confidence. One of them started to speak, to deny, to explain, but the agent held up a hand. "Save it for your lawyer." Meanwhile, in the holding room, the woman stood and smoothed her blouse. She took a deep breath, not out of relief, but resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What happened next would determine whether this was just one cleanup job or the start of real change. Her colleague handed her a fresh set of credentials. "You ready?" She nodded. "Let's go meet them." When they walked into the main room, all eyes turned. Some officers looked away. Others stared, confused. The 2 suspended men froze when they saw her. Recognition flickered, then disbelief, then dread. She stopped a few feet away, calm, composed. "You thought I was just another person you could disappear," she said, voice low but clear. "But I've been watching you longer than you've been watching me." She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, a quiet force in a system that had mistaken silence for weakness. Outside, the sun had set. Streetlights hummed to life. Somewhere a siren wailed in the distance, not for her, but for someone else caught in the same broken cycle. She knew this arrest wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And sometimes a start is enough to make the guilty nervous and the innocent hopeful. As she stepped out of the precinct, badge clipped back to her belt, she didn't look back. There was still work to do, files to review, testimonies to prepare, reforms to push. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small, private exhale. The trap had been set, and the hunters had just become the hunted. The precinct didn't feel like a police station anymore. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, a stage without an audience, just tension thick enough to choke on. Officers moved slower, spoke quieter, avoided eye contact. The 2 who'd been suspended sat in separate interview rooms down the hall, each surrounded by agents who asked the same questions in different ways, circling back like hawks. Their stories didn't match. Not even close. And that was the problem. She didn't sit in on the interrogations. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough in the car, heard enough in the holding room to know how this would unfold. Instead, she stood by a window on the 2nd floor, watching the parking lot fill with unmarked sedans and federal plates. More agents, more paperwork, more truth clawing its way into the light. Her phone buzzed. A message from her team. "We've got the tow yard logs." They held 3 vehicles longer than protocol. Each one later reported clean, but had street-level drugs found nearby within 48 hours. She nodded to herself. It was all connected. The drugs they seized during stops never made it to evidence. They were siphoned off, repackaged, and sold back into the neighborhoods they claimed to protect. And the people who suffered? The ones with no voice, no lawyer, no way out? They took the fall while the real criminals wore badges. One of the suspended officers, Reynolds, asked to speak with her directly. Not through a lawyer, not through a union rep, just her. She considered it for a long moment. Protocol said no. Emotion said maybe. But instinct said yes. She walked into the interview room alone. He sat at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes red-rimmed. The arrogance from earlier was gone, replaced by something raw and shaky. "I didn't think you'd be—" "You," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't sit, just leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "What did you think I was?" He looked down at his hands. Another nobody. Someone we could move through the system and forget about. "And how many nobodies have you done this to?" she asked, not angry, just tired. Tired of the pattern, tired of the waste, tired of good people losing years of their lives because someone in uniform decided they didn't matter. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, 6, maybe 7. We never kept count. She closed her eyes for a second. 7 lives derailed. Jobs lost, families broken. Also 2 men could line their pockets and feel powerful. "Who gave the orders?" she asked. He hesitated. "It wasn't orders. It just started. One time we found a bag during a stop. My partner said, 'Why give it to evidence when we can use it?' I said no at first. But then it got easier. Too easy." She watched him carefully. He wasn't lying. But he wasn't telling the whole truth either. There was someone higher up, someone who turned a blind eye or gave a nod. Maybe even someone who took a cut. "You know what happens now," she said. He swallowed hard. "Yeah, you'll go to prison. Your pension's gone. Your name will be in every news report. And the people you hurt, they'll never get those years back." He nodded, tears welling but not falling. "I know." She turned to leave. "Wait," he said. "Why didn't you fight back in the car?" Most people would have yelled, screamed, tried to run. She paused at the door. "Because I knew you'd show your hand sooner or later. And I wanted the whole world to see it." Back in the command room, her team was piecing together financial records, bank deposits, cash withdrawals, a second mortgage on one officer's house that didn't match his salary, text messages between the officers and a known mid-level dealer, coded but clear enough once you knew what to look for. Pick up the package meant drugs. Deliver the groceries meant payment. It was crude, almost laughable in its simplicity, but it had worked for years. By late evening, federal prosecutors had enough to file formal charges: conspiracy, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and possession with intent to distribute. The case was airtight, and it was only the beginning. News of the arrests leaked by morning. Not officially, someone always talks, but enough that local reporters started calling. The department issued a vague statement about an ongoing internal review, but the community wasn't buying it. Rumors spread faster than facts, that a federal agent had been framed, that the whole precinct was dirty, that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Outside the station, a small crowd gathered, not angry, not yet, but watchful. Parents with kids, elders who remembered other scandals, young men who'd been stopped a dozen times for driving while black. They didn't chant, didn't hold signs. They just stood there waiting to see if this time someone would actually be held accountable. She watched them from an upper window. This was the part no one trained for, the weight of expectation. Not just from the law, but from real people who'd lost faith long ago. If this case collapsed, if the officers walked, it wouldn't just be a legal failure. It would be a betrayal, but if it held, if justice actually happened, maybe, just maybe someone would believe the system could work, even for them. Later that day, she met with the district attorney. They reviewed the evidence together line by line. No corners cut. No assumptions. Every detail verified. The DA, a woman who'd spent 20 years fighting uphill battles, looked up and said, "This is solid. But it's not just about these two. It's about who let them operate." "I know," she replied, "and we're not stopping here." That night she drove home alone. No escort, no fanfare. Just her, the road, and the quiet hum of the city. She thought about the 7 people wrongfully charged. She'd already assigned a team to track them down, to offer legal help, to apologize on behalf of a system that had failed them. It wouldn't give them back their time, but it might give them back their dignity. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone rang. It was the tow yard owner, calling from a payphone, voice trembling. "I didn't know it was that bad," he said. "I just did what they told me. But I've got records, names, dates, I'll give you everything." She listened, took notes. Didn't promise immunity, just fairness. When she hung up, she sat in the car for a long time, staring at the stars. The night felt different now, lighter somehow. Not because the work was done, it wasn't, but because the truth was finally moving. And once truth starts moving, it's hard to stop. Tomorrow, the real reckoning would begin. Testimonies, press conferences, policy reviews. But tonight? Tonight, she allowed herself one quiet moment of hope. Because sometimes the person you try to bury is the one who ends up digging your grave. The city didn't wake up to sirens or headlines the next morning. It woke up to silence, the kind that comes right before a storm breaks. But in that quiet, something unusual was happening. People were talking. Not just in hushed tones behind closed doors, but openly. On buses, in barbershops, at kitchen tables. They weren't just asking what happened, they were asking why it took so long for someone to do something about it. The two officers sat in county jail, denied bail. Their mugshots circulated online, not with sensational captions but with simple facts. Charged with planting drugs. Targeted a federal agent, part of a wider corruption probe. The story spread fast, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt familiar. Too many people recognized the pattern. The traffic stop that turned into a trap, the missing evidence, the sudden discovery of drugs that weren't there before. For once, though, the person on the other side of that story hadn't vanished into the system. She'd come out the other side with receipts, but not everyone saw her as a hero. Inside law enforcement circles, the reaction was split. Some officers sent quiet messages of support. Thank you for cleaning house. Others muttered about betrayal, about one bad apple ruining it for everyone. A few even suggested she'd set the officers up, that the whole thing was a federal power grab. She heard the rumors, of course. She always did, but she didn't respond. She knew the truth didn't need defending. It just needed time to land. What surprised her more was the backlash from outside the system. Not from the public, that part she expected, but from certain corners of the media. One talk show host called her a wolf in sheep's clothing, claiming she'd used her position to entrap local police. Another columnist wrote that her refusal to speak publicly was suspicious, as if silence were proof of guilt rather than discipline. She read the pieces once, then deleted the alerts. She'd learned long ago that noise isn't truth and outrage isn't justice. Meanwhile, her team kept working. The tow yard owner came through with boxes of handwritten logs, photos of impounded cars, even voice recordings of late-night calls from one of the officers. A dispatcher from the precinct, fearing she'd be next, reached out through a secure tip line. She'd seen altered call records, fake timestamps, even deleted body cam footage. Each new piece didn't just confirm the corruption, it showed how organized it had become. This wasn't two rogue cops. This was a network. The department's leadership scrambled. The chief held a press conference flanked by stiff-faced deputies promising full cooperation and zero tolerance. But his words rang hollow. He hadn't launched an internal probe until after federal agents showed up. He hadn't questioned the missing drugs until someone higher up forced his hand. And now, as cameras flashed, he looked less like a leader and more like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. She didn't attend the press event. Instead, she sat in a small conference room with 3 people who'd been wrongfully arrested in similar stops over the past year. They weren't famous, didn't have lawyers waiting in the wings. One had lost his job. Another had been separated from his kids during pretrial detention. The third, a college student, had dropped out after her case derailed her scholarships. She listened to each of them without interrupting. No notes, no legal jargon, just eye contact and silence where it was needed. When they finished, she said simply, "We're going to fix this." She didn't promise miracles. Didn't say their records would vanish overnight. But she told them the truth. Their cases would be reopened, the evidence re-examined, and if wrongdoing was found, and it would be, they'd get official apologies, legal support, and help rebuilding what was lost. One of them cried. Not from sadness, but from disbelief that anyone in power had actually shown up for them. That afternoon, she met with city officials and federal prosecutors to draft emergency reforms. No more solo traffic stops for drug searches, mandatory dual body cam activation during any vehicle search, a civilian oversight panel with real authority, not just symbolic presence, and most importantly, a secure, anonymous channel for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. She'd seen too many good cops stay silent because speaking up meant becoming a target. Some officials pushed back. "It'll slow down operations," one said. "It'll make officers hesitant," argued another. She looked at them evenly. Better hesitant than dishonest. By week's end, the state attorney general announced a full audit of every drug-related arrest from the precinct over the last 3 years. Over 200 cases would be reviewed. Dozens might be overturned. And for the first time, The department would be required to publish quarterly reports on evidence handling. Publicly, transparently, with names redacted only when legally necessary. Still, the personal cost weighed on her. Friends from earlier in her career stopped returning calls. An old mentor sent a terse email. "You've made enemies in places that matter." She read it, then tucked it away. She'd known this path would be lonely. Integrity often is. One evening, as she walked to her car after another long day, a young officer she didn't recognize approached her. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "My brother was one of the ones you're helping," he said quietly. "He spent 8 months in jail for something he didn't do." I didn't believe him at first. Thought he was making excuses, but now, I see it. She waited. "I just wanted to say thank you," he finished. "And I want to do better," she nodded. "Then start by speaking up when something feels wrong. Even if it's small. Especially if it's small." He gave a tight smile and walked away. Back home, she made tea and sat by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, each one a life touched, sometimes broken, sometimes rebuilt, by the choices of those in power. She thought about the officers who'd planted those drugs, convinced they were untouchable. They hadn't seen her as a threat because she didn't look like one. No uniform, no swagger, just a woman driving home. And that, she realized, was their biggest mistake. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it listens, watches, waits. And when the time comes, it acts. Not for glory, but for the people who never got a fair shot the first time. Tomorrow, the hearings would begin. Testimonies would be given. Careers would end. But tonight, in the quiet, she allowed herself to feel something rare. Not victory, but purpose. Clear, steady, and unshaken. Because real change doesn't come from headlines. It comes from showing up day after day when no one's watching and doing what's right anyway. Document Part 5, 1,400 words. The courtroom wasn't grand. No towering columns or stained glass, just pale walls, scuffed floors, and rows of hard wooden benches that creaked every time someone shifted. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, casting long rectangles across the floor like silent witnesses. It was here, in this ordinary room, that the final chapter of a quietly explosive story would be written. The two former officers sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the tabletop. They'd taken a plea deal. No trial, no dramatic cross-examinations. The evidence was too overwhelming, the recordings too clear, the paper trail too deep. They admitted to planting drugs, falsifying reports, and working with outside dealers to redistribute seized narcotics. In exchange, they'd avoid a life sentence. But they wouldn't avoid prison. Not by a long shot. She sat in the back row, not in uniform, not with a title pinned to her chest, just as a citizen. She didn't need to testify. Her dashcam footage, her secure logs, and the corroborating statements from other officers had already done the talking. Still, she came. Not for revenge, not for satisfaction, but because someone had to bear witness not just to the crime, but to the cost. The judge read the sentence slowly, deliberately. 8 years for one, 10 for the other. No parole for the first 5. Their faces didn't change much. Maybe they'd expected worse. Or maybe they'd stopped expecting anything at all. Afterward, as people filed out, a reporter approached her near the courthouse steps. "Can we get a comment?" he asked, microphone extended. She shook her head gently. Not today. She'd given no interviews since the case broke. No TV appearances, no opinion pieces. She believed actions spoke louder, and she'd let hers do the talking. Back at the DEA office, things had changed. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily. The reforms she'd pushed for were now policy. Every drug seizure in the region now required dual verification, time-stamped video, and digital chain of custody logs. A new ethics hotline, managed by an independent third party, had already received over 50 tips in its first month, some about minor infractions, others about serious misconduct. Each one was being reviewed, but her focus had shifted. She wasn't just cleaning up the past anymore. She was building something for the future. Every Tuesday afternoon, she met with a small group of new recruits, most of them young, many of them women of color, all of them sharp-eyed and cautious. They didn't wear blinders. They knew the system wasn't perfect. But they also believed it could be better. She didn't lecture them. She told stories. Not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones. The moments when doing the right thing felt impossible, but you did it anyway. She taught them how to document everything, how to trust their instincts, and most importantly, how to protect themselves when the people around them started cutting corners. One recruit asked her once, "How do you stay honest when everyone else is playing a different game?" She thought for a moment. "You remember who you're really working for," she said. "Not your badge, not your boss, the people who can't fight back." Months passed. The scandal faded from the front pages, replaced by newer headlines. But in the neighborhoods most affected, the change was real. Traffic stops dropped by nearly 40% in the precinct, once known for aggressive policing. Complaints about planted evidence fell to zero. And for the first time in years, community meetings included officers who actually listened, without defensiveness, without excuses. She visited one of those meetings quietly, standing in the back near the door. No one recognized her. She watched as a grandmother spoke about how her grandson had been stopped 3 times in 1 month last year. Always late at night, always alone, always let go with no explanation. "This year, not once. Feels like we can breathe again," she said, voice trembling just slightly. No one clapped. No one made a speech. But the room held that moment like something precious. Later, as she walked to her car, a teenager approached her. He couldn't have been older than 17. Hoodie pulled low, hands in his pockets. "You the one who took down those cops?" he asked, voice low. She didn't confirm or deny. Just said, "Why do you ask?" "My cousin was one of the ones they locked up. Said they found drugs in his trunk. He swore they weren't there." Nobody believed him. He paused. "Now they dropped the charges. Gave him a lawyer. Said sorry." She nodded. "He deserves more than sorry. But it's a start." The boy looked at her for a long moment. "You ever scared?" he asked. "Every day," she said honestly. "But fear doesn't have to win." He gave a small nod, then walked off, disappearing into the evening crowd. She drove home as the sun dipped below the skyline. Her apartment was modest. Books stacked on shelves, a single plant by the window that she forgot to water sometimes. A photo of her mother on the nightstand. There were no trophies on the wall, no framed headlines. Just a life lived with purpose, not performance. She often thought about retiring. Not because she was tired, though she was, but because she believed the work should outlive the person doing it. Real change wasn't about one hero. It was about systems that kept working even when the spotlight moved on. A few weeks later, she received a letter. No return address, just a plain envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the wrongfully arrested men. He'd gotten his job back, reconnected with his daughter, started community college. At the bottom, he'd written, "You didn't just clear my name. You gave me back my life." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with others like it. Not for pride, just to remember. Years from now, people might forget the details of the case, the names, the dates, the courtroom drama. But they'd remember the shift. The moment things started to feel different, fairer, safer, not perfect, but possible. And if anyone ever asked how it began, they'd say it started with a woman in a silver sedan, driving home on an ordinary afternoon, who refused to let injustice pass unnoticed. She never sought fame, never wanted a statue or a story. But in the quiet spaces between policy changes and courtroom rulings, in the lives quietly rebuilt and the trust slowly restored, her legacy grew, not in stone but in people. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can be is the person who shows up, calm, certain and unafraid to do what's right, even when no one's watching.